So good afternoon all. My talk will be divided into two parts. So in the first part, I'll try to motivate the need for Bayesian modeling, and I will be motivating it using results from human category learning experiments. And in the second part of my talk, I will explain how we can use Bayesian modeling approach to check which theoretical position can better explain the data. So, the classical notion of concepts, we define a concepts to consist of a set of necessary and sufficient features. Basically, it is the definition of the concept. So if something has the properties mentioned in the definition, then that item or object belongs to the category or the concept. A often cited example is that of bachelor. So bachelor has a necessary and sufficient conditions. That is, the person should be adult, person should be male, and the person should be unmarried. So anything that satisfies all these necessary and sufficient conditions should belong to the category. However, when we ask people, is sparrow a bird? And then if we ask them, is penguin a bird? People tend to respond faster when we ask them, is sparrow a bird? For this question, people tend to give the response in a faster manner compared to some outlier example. So the argument made after observing this is that if concepts consisted of a set of necessary and sufficient condition, then there should not be any difference in time. Basically, we just need to check whether those conditions are met, whether those features are present. If they are present, then the item should belong to the category. So there should not be any difference in response times. Also, we find that if we ask participants which is a better exemplar or better member of some category, let us say bird, and ask them to order objects according to their being a good exemplar of a particular category, then people tend to come up with a ordering which is fairly consistent. So an item or an exemplar that shares more features with other items of the category, for example sparrow, is rated to be a better exemplar of the category compared to some other objects like penguin or ostrich. So when all these results were observed, it was suggested that concepts are represented by a set of attributes, basically family resemblances, that may not be defining the features of a category. So any one feature need not necessarily be present in the members of a category. So, however, what happened in the early 80s was people started doing people were doing experiments earlier also, but people started doing experiments with artificial categories that had binary features. So there were a set of features, and it was shown that participants tend to use a simple rule, a unidimensional rule for learning the categories. Participants tend to use a category representation that was closer to the classical notion of concepts and not the family resemblance based representation. And this was true even for category structures where there was no defining feature. For example, in this particular case that is given here, members of category A do not have any one defining feature. So there is no one feature which is common across all the members of the category. Some features are more common to category A and other features are more common to category B. For example, this pointy mouth that we see here is more common to members of category A, and the pointed upper fin that we see here is more common to members of category B. However, there is no one feature which is present in all the members. So there is no one defining feature that we can find, but we can identify members using multiple features. So when this category structure was used, even here it was observed that participants tend to use simple rules, simple unidimensional rules to learn to discriminate between these two categories. So the experimental procedures that we are talking about, in them, the stimuli were presented serially, that is one after the other. The stimuli was presented, so only one stimulus was presented on the screen at a time. So the explanation for this preference for simple rules is that analytical, so when people are made to do, to learn artificial categories in a lab setting, they tend to analyze the information in an analytical manner. So because they're analyzing information in an analytical manner, there is a preference for simple rules that can define a category. Another explanation along similar lines is that participants are trying to discriminate between two categories in the simplest possible way. There is a bias towards simplicity, simplest possible representation that would do the that will help them perform the task. So now the question is, does this explanation always work? So the answer is no. So if we have a slightly different experimental procedure where we show the stimuli in an array. So now we are showing stimuli in a simultaneously, not serially, in this particular way. So all the members of one category, so there are two groups here, group 1 and group 2, and the members of each group are also shown simultaneously, and then people are asked to categorize this target or test stimulus. And people now do not tend to use a simple rule. They tend to look for a overall similarity, even though there is a simplest possible rule. So simplest possible rule here is this shape of the chimney, which is the same for all the members of group 1, and it is also again same for all the members of group 2, but people do not tend to use that. People tend to use multiple features. Here one question that might come up is that of visual saliency. So perhaps this chimney thing is not very visually salient, and that is the reason. But that is not the case. Actually, we have replicated this result, and they had many different stimuli in their set. This is just one example. So and also they have accounted for saliency. So they have a series of experiment in this paper, and the overall conclusion was people do not tend to use the simplest possible representation in this case. So now why is that people do not use the simplest possible explanation? So our first task was to replicate these results, the results of these two different experimental procedures. So we used this kind of a stimuli that you can see here. So now members of category A all have a defining feature. So in this example, all the members of category A have this flat upper fin, and all the members of category B have this pointy upper fin, and the remaining features are partially diagnostic of category membership. What I mean by that is this mouth is not a pointy mouth, and that is more frequent in category A, and the pointy mouth is more frequent in category B. However, it is not present in all the members of the category. Some members do not have that feature. So these features are partially diagnostic. So the transfer or the test stimuli were constructed from the members of category A and B by flipping the defining feature. So defining feature in this example is the upper fin. So the transfer stimuli that you see on the first row is same as what you see here. The first row transfer stimuli are same as category A members, except that the defining feature or the perfectly diagnostic feature has been flipped. So this upper fin, from flat upper fin, we have flipped it to the pointy upper fin. And similarly, the members of category B were taken, and we have flipped the perfectly diagnostic feature to obtain the transfer stimuli in the last row. So now what we can do is we can let the participants learn category A and B, and then we can see how they perform on the transfer for the transfer stimuli. Do they use the simplest possible representation? If they are using the simplest possible representation, then they should go by the perfectly diagnostic feature, which is the upper fin. So we compared two experimental procedures. So one is called feedback learning, and other is called array-based classification. We saw it in the previous slide. So in feedback learning, stimuli is presented one by one, and we have a training phase. So in the training phase, we show the members of the categories in a random fashion, and they need to learn to correctly identify the members of the category as belonging to the appropriate category. And if they are not able to achieve 90% accuracy, they go back and start all over again. So the training phase is repeated until the participants are able to achieve 90% accuracy. Once they achieve 90% accuracy, they move to the next phase, which is called transfer phase, where all the test stimuli that we saw in the previous slide are presented again in a serial manner, and they need to categorize them as category A or B items. And at the end, we do a all features test. Is there a question? Okay, so yes, Venkat.
Sorry, quick question. So, in the training phase, so how much time do they get to sort of observe these stimuli classes and so on?
Yeah, that is a good question. Actually, it is a self-paced manner. They can do it in a self-paced manner. So we are not restricting the time. So they do it in a self-paced manner. Yes.
I see. Thank you.
And at the end, we have a all features test where we basically show the features one by one and ask them which category that feature is more commonly seen. So every feature is more common in one of the two categories, and that is what we are asking at the end. And this last phase, which is all features test, is a surprise phase. That is, we are not telling the participants in advance that this is going to come, because otherwise they will focus on all the features. So we don't want that to happen. So this last phase is a kind of a something that we have not told the participants in advance. So that is one experimental procedure. And the second experimental procedure you can see on the right hand side, which is very simple, because we do not have a training phase here, because all the stimuli we are presenting simultaneously on the screen. So basically we show the members of the two categories, and at the bottom we show the transfer stimulus and ask them to categorize them as category A or B. So that is all that we do. And they need to do it 2 times. So I forgot to mention earlier that in the transfer phase, every transfer stimuli is categorized twice. And in the all features test phase, every dimension is tested 4 times. So this will be important later on. So that is how we have the 2 experimental procedure. One experimental procedure, all the stimuli is presented serially. Other, we have simultaneous presentation, and we let them categorize the transfer stimuli. So the results that we obtain is that 80% of the time participants prefer to categorize based on the defining feature. So this defining feature is also referred to as CA dimension in some of the papers. So that is why I'm calling it CA categorization. So that is basically the simplest possible representation that they could use. So 80% of the responses that we obtained were based on this simple representation for the condition C1. C1 is the feedback learning that we saw in the previous slide. C2 is where we are presenting the stimuli in a simultaneous manner. And now we can see that the percentage of CA categorization is very less. It is in fact less than 40%. One point I missed to mention is that we are using multiple sets of stimuli. So this is one set where the upper fin happens to be the defining feature, and we have 4 more sets where different features form the defining feature. So in another set, maybe the mouth will be the defining feature, and in another set, maybe the tail will be the defining feature, and so on. So we have this 5 sets of stimuli, and we are using all these 5 sets same number of times in an experiment. And participants get to see one of these 5 sets. So each participant gets is randomly assigned to one of these 5 stimuli sets, and the experiment is based on that set for that participant. And every set, as I said, is used the same number of times in the experiment. So basically that means the number of participants that we have should be multiples of 5. Then only we can do that. So so the result that we see here, the 80% CA categorization is across all the 5 sets. So this is not due to one feature being too visually salient or anything. So this is the overall result that we are talking about. So 80% of the time, participants did prefer a simple representation, and that was not the case when we presented the information in an array. And this difference is significant. So we can do an independent sample t-test. How about the last phase of the experiment where we tested for their knowledge about the features? So it turns out that in condition C1, that feedback learning where stimuli is presented serially, the CA dimension or the perfectly diagnostic feature is learned with a very high level of accuracy. In fact, the accuracy is more than 90%, but that is not true for the other features, other partially diagnostic features. So partially diagnostic features are not learned that accurately. So, and this difference between the accuracies is significant. So this made us come up with this alternate explanation for why simple rules are preferred. So the explanation that we wanted to put forward was participants use simple rules to learn categories because it is difficult to learn all the category level information when stimuli are presented serially. So when knowledge about all the features is available, there is less preference for simple rules. As we can see, when the stimuli is presented simultaneously, all the information is visually available. So there is less preference for the simplest possible rule. People are using multiple features, but when stimuli is presented serially, it is difficult to learn all the features, and therefore people are using simple unidimensional rules. So this explanation was not very well received. The reason is that the reviewers said that it could also be the other way around. That is, there is a bias towards simple rules, and that is why they tend to learn the perfectly diagnostic feature better. They are focusing on which feature will best, which single feature will best categorize the help them identify the two categories. And since they are focusing on single features, they are learning the perfectly diagnostic feature better and not the partially diagnostic feature. So they were not willing to accept our explanation. So now this is where Bayesian modeling comes in. So we have some data and we have different explanations for the observed data, and we want to see which explanation is better supported by the observational the data that is observed. So basically the problem is we need to choose between different theoretical positions, which are basically different explanations for some pattern that we see. And we need to answer the following question: which theory better explains the data? Yes, Venkat, please go ahead.
Sujit, could it be that different subjects could sort of do, could follow a different theory depending on their sort of inclinations?
Yes, that is possible. But our the group from which we took the participants is the same, and we were randomly assigning them to condition C1 and C2. So any difference? So these are basically students. So students did it for in exchange for partial course credit. And the way we do it is we randomly assign the subjects to either of the two conditions. So any difference that we see in the two conditions should not be because of differences in participants.
I see. Okay.
Okay, so so this is where we make use of Bayesian cognitive modeling. So we wanted to build on top of existing work. So we have a prototype model which is based on the prototype theory, where the representation is based on the common features of each category, basically family resemblance structure. So the prototype is that member which has all the common features in for all the dimensions of the stimuli. So now the distance metric that is usually used is the difference between the so xi is the transfer stimulus I, and j is the jth dimension of the transfer stimulus, and pa is the prototype of category A. And for every dimension we are finding the difference. So difference will be 0 if the transfer stimulus and the prototype has the same feature in a particular dimension. If both of them agree on some feature, then this difference is 0. Otherwise, this difference is 1. And so essentially, this we are summing. We are trying to find how many features are different for the transfer stimulus when compared to the prototype of category A. And we are doing one more thing. We are associating a weight for each dimension j, and this we are calling attentional weights. Basically, this will be able to model how much attention a participant is paying to a particular stimuli dimension. So that gives us the distance metric, and then we use the then we find the probability of categorizing the stimulus I to category A using this here. So basically, we are the distance we are finding e to the power minus c, the distance from the prototype A, divided by distance of from prototype A plus distance from prototype B. We have a parameter c here, which is called generalization parameter in the earlier papers. And so this is the probability of categorizing a transfer stimulus to category A. And we for each participant. Yes, Professor Snehanshu.
Sujit, is this a distance metric or a distance function?
What is the difference?
Well, the distance metric satisfies three properties. Distance function doesn't. I mean, you have the
triangular inequality.
Triangular, I mean, are you sure this satisfies triangular inequality?
Yeah, that is a good question. I maybe I'll have to think about this actually. Okay. But Manhattan distance does satisfy triangular inequality, no?
Okay. But your PAJ is a what is your PAJ? Some probability, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. No, PAJ is the prototype. So prototype of category A.
Okay. Then it's fine. Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah. Okay.
So now we have a observed variable RIKA. Basically, it tells us how many times stimulus I was categorized to category A by participant K. So K is the participant, I is the transfer stimulus, and A is how many times it was categorized to category A in the transfer phase. So in the transfer phase, as I said earlier, every transfer stimulus was categorized twice. So the number of times a stimulus might be categorized to category A will be 0, 1, or 2. 2 is the maximum possible value that this variable can take, and this is the observed variable. And we assume that this comes this comes from a binomial distribution. Basically, we have this probability pi, probability of categorizing to category A, and we have two Bernoulli trials. And basically, how many times did we categorize it to category A? So it's like we have a probability of getting heads, and we had two trials, and how many times did we get the head? That will be the probability of observing this particular data. So we have a data point corresponding to every transfer stimulus. So for this data point, given all the parameters, so parameters in this example will be all the weights associated with dimensions, and this generalization parameter C, and that is all there is. So that will be our the parameter vector. So once we are given the parameters, then the probability of observing this comes from the binomial distribution. So we modified this model because we wanted to associate how well participants have learned the various stimulus dimensions with this distance metric. So for that, all we have done is we have introduced a parameter S, which can be either 1 or 0, depending on how well the participants have learned the stimulus dimension. The parameter S comes from a step function where tjk is the accuracy of the kth participant for the jth dimension. So as I said in the earlier slide, each stimulus dimension was tested 4 times in the final phase. So what is the accuracy? So the accuracy can be 0 upon 4, 1 upon 4, 2 upon 4, and so on. And theta I is a parameter. This is what we want to find. We want to find more about this parameter, whether there is such a parameter. That is, whether there is some threshold above which, if the accuracy is above that threshold, then the dimension will be used. So that is the relation that we are trying to capture here, and we are using a step function. So step function will be 1 if the argument is non-negative, and it will be 0 if the argument is negative. So basically tjk minus theta 1, if it is negative, then the step function will give a 0, otherwise it will give a 1. So basically, if the accuracy along first dimension is greater than or equal to theta 1, then the step function will be 1, and this parameter S will be 1. So that means that dimension will be counted while finding the distance. Otherwise, it will not be counted. We are using different thresholds, theta 1 and theta 2, for the first dimension and the remaining 4 dimensions. The reason is that, as I said earlier, we are having 5 sets of stimuli where a different dimension forms the defining dimension. So what we have done is, in the representation that we are using, the first dimension is always the defining feature. So if in the stimulus set some other feature is the defining feature, then we are simply rotating that vector such that the defining feature becomes the first feature and the partially diagnostic features become the remaining features. So the reason we are doing is we want to differentiate only between the perfectly and partially diagnostic features. We don't want to differentiate between different partially diagnostic features. So that is why if the dimension is 1, j is equal to 1 means we are talking about the perfectly diagnostic feature, and we have a threshold parameter theta 1 for the perfectly diagnostic feature, and we have the same threshold parameters theta 2 for all the remaining partially diagnostic features. Now coming to attentional weights. So here again, we will use different weights only for the perfectly and partially diagnostic dimensions. So we are going to use the same weights for all the partially diagnostic dimensions, because we are not trying to differentiate between the partially diagnostic features. Actually, in the representation that we are using, first dimension is always the perfectly diagnostic dimension. So so any of the five dimensions can be mapped to the first dimension, and the same is true for the remaining dimensions also. So depending on the set, a different dimension might be mapped to the second dimension, and so on. So we do not want to differentiate between the remaining dimensions. So that is why we are using the same weight W for the remaining, which is alpha by 4. Here alpha is a parameter. The weight for the first dimension will be 1 minus alpha, and for the remaining dimension it will be alpha by 4. The reason we are doing this is in the previous work, the weight, the sum of the attentional weights is equal to 1. So that is how they have modeled it. So we just wanted to use the same idea. So for that reason we have used this. So basically 1 minus alpha, plus we have 4 dimensions that have a weight alpha by 4. So 4 times alpha by 4, which will give us 1, which will always be 1. So basically we are using parameter alpha to change the weights for the perfectly and partially diagnostic dimensions. So we have some free parameters in our model. Alpha is a free parameter. Alpha determines the attentional weight, as we saw earlier. Alpha can be any value between 0 and 1. So the prior distribution for alpha is uniform distribution between 0 and 1. Earlier when I showed you the probabilities, we had a generalization parameter C in the exponent part. So that can take values between 0 and 20, again uniform distribution. So this 20 I have obtained seems to be a good value across multiple experiments. So whatever posterior distribution I get usually is much less than 20. So this range 0 to 20 was based on multiple experiments. So this we tend to keep the same. Theta 1 was a discrete uniform distribution, and the discrete values it could take was 0, 0.25, 0.5, 0.75, and 1. This is because the dimensions are tested 4 times, and the accuracy values can be one of these 5 values. And because we are trying to find the lower bound on the accuracy with which a dimension must be learned, we are using discrete values. So these are the prior values for the threshold for the first dimension, which is the defining dimension. And now we have the prior distribution for theta 2, which determines the threshold for the remaining partially diagnostic dimensions. So once we have the values for the stochastic variables, we can find the values of the other variables happen to be deterministic variables whose values are determined by the stochastic variables in the model. And we have 2 observed variables so that we find from the data. The first one is the accuracies for the various dimensions for participant K, and how participant K has categorized each of the 10 transfer stimulus. How many times was the transfer stimulus categorized to category A? So that is the second observed variable. So the likelihood of Rik given all the parameter theta vector is a probability given by the binomial distribution. So now we have all the ingredients to define our likelihood function. So what is the probability of the data given a particular parameter theta? So we have 4 free parameters in our model. These are the free parameters, and these form our theta vector. So the data consists of k participants. So in our examples, we had 55 participants. So given a particular a particular value of theta, we will assume that how participants categorize is independent of each other. So if we make that independence assumption, then this will be the product of how kth participant categorizes the 10 transfer stimulus given a particular value of theta. Now, if we have the kth participant, we know the accuracy of that participant, and also we have all the other parameters. So we have fixed all the free parameters, and we also know the accuracies for the kth participant. So if all this information is given, then we can assume that how the participant is categorizing in jth trial will be independent of how he categorizes in j plus 1th trial. Basically, the parameter theta is fixing the strategy that participant is going to use. So we know all the different parameters. So if the strategy is fixed, then we are assuming that the participant simply uses that strategy in every trial, and how the participant response in one trial is independent of the other trials given a particular strategy. So basically, in other words, we are assuming that participant does not change his strategy, in the middle of the transfer phase. Some strategy the participant has been using, and the person keeps on using that strategy. So if we make that independence assumption, then the likelihood becomes the product of observing RIKA given a particular value of the parameters. So now we have the likelihood function and the prior. So now we can look at the posterior distributions. So we had 55 participants, as I said, and for 55 participants, we have data for each of the 10 transfer stimuli. So we have 55 times 10 data points, 550 data points. And we obtained 12,000 samples from the joint posterior distribution of the parameters using Markov chain Monte Carlo and Gibbs sampling method. So I have used 3 chains that start from random positions in the parameter space. And I have checked whether the chains converge. So I have used R statistic to check whether the chain converges to a stationary distribution, and we could and the chains indeed converge to the stationary distribution. So the samples that we are obtaining is indeed coming from the stationary distribution. So now let's look at what does the posterior distribution looks like. So this is for weight W1, which is basically the attentional weight associated with the first stimuli dimension, and the weight has a high value, 0.6. The remaining 4 dimensions have a value which is 0.1. So then the sum of weights should be 1. So the first dimension itself has a very high value of 0.6, and the theta 1 here is 1. So basically, the first dimension is used only when the accuracy is 100%. They were absolutely sure of that dimension. So the attentional weight that we see here is not surprising, because the previous studies have shown that for feedback learning, there is a strong preference for simple rules. And if there is a strong preference for simple rules, our model will be has to increase the value of the attentional weight for the first parameter. So this is something that is consistent with what has been reported earlier. I will quickly discuss why the threshold parameter theta 1 is 1. So let me just go back to one of the earlier slide. So here we saw that the accuracy for the first dimension, was high. So this is typically the case for feedback learning. The accuracy for the first dimension is very high, and so that is so most participants learned the first dimension with a high accuracy. So the fact that θ1 is the threshold is 1 is not very surprising. What will be more interesting will be the information about the partially diagnostic dimensions. Now let us look at the attentional weight and the threshold values for the partially diagnostic dimensions. So here the first thing we see is that the attentional weights are less. It is close to 0.1. So this we could infer from previous graph itself. And the interesting thing is that the threshold parameters, the posterior marginal posterior distribution is mostly concentrated at 0.75 and 1. So it is mostly concentrated at 1, and a little some of the samples were also corresponded to 0.75. So this suggests that participants were using the partially diagnostic dimensions only when they had learned it with a very high level of accuracy. But these are only indications. We cannot say that indeed is the case. So in order to do that, we need to do something called Bayes factor analysis that I will explain next. So let us say that the model that we saw is model 0, where all the parameters can freely, the stochastic parameters can take values that come from uniform distributions, and we will modify this model 0 in some particular ways. So in model 1 is same as model 0, except that the threshold parameter for the partially diagnostic dimension, we want it to be to take non-zero values only for 0.75 and 1. So the prior distribution has non-zero values for 0.75 and 1. For the remaining values, the prior probability is 0. So what does this model represent? So I will come to that. One model that we construct is by changing the prior distribution for parameter θ2. All the other details remain the same as earlier. So everything else is same as model 0 that we have discussed until the previous slide. For model 2, again we change the prior distribution for θ2. How we change is we let the parameter θ2 take the remaining values except 0.75 and 1. Now these models correspond to some theoretical positions. So the first model here corresponds to theoretical position 1. Basically, when we are setting θ2 to be high, we are saying that a partially diagnostic dimension will be used only when it has been learned with a high accuracy. Because in the step function, whatever value that θ2 takes, it will be either 0.75 or 1. And if the accuracy is not above that, then the step function will give us 0, and that dimension won't be used for finding the distances. So by fixing the prior distribution in this manner, we are essentially saying that the partially diagnostic dimension must be learned with a high level of accuracy. And what are we saying for model 2? So for model 2 also corresponds to some theoretical position. So that is what we have here. Theoretical position 2 corresponds to model 2. Here we are saying is what we are saying is a partially diagnostic dimension need not be learned with a high accuracy. So we are saying it need not be learned. So what that means is the accuracy can be 1, that is fine, but the threshold parameter θ2 will be 0, 0.25 or 0.5. So now let us say that the accuracy is 1. If the parameter θ2 is 0.5, the argument to the step function will be positive. The accuracy minus theta2 will be some positive number. So the parameter s in the distance will be 1. So what we are saying is here in model 2 is the accuracy need not necessarily be high. It can be high, that is fine, but it need not necessarily be high. In for model 1, we are saying it has to be high for it to be used. For model 2, we are saying it need not be high. So that distinction is little bit important. So so model 2 allows a partially diagnostic dimension to be used at any level of accuracy, because we are also allowing theta2 to be 0. So if theta2 is 0, then it does not matter what accuracy we have, the step function will be 1. So now this model 1 and model 2 corresponds to alternative and null hypothesis. Actually, the theoretical positions that we have constructed here are the alternative and null hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis is that the accuracy must be high. The null hypothesis is that the accuracy need not be high. Now the question is how we should compare these two models. So how we do that is by finding the marginal likelihood. Basically, we will find what is the mean value of the likelihood function for a given model. So probability of D given a model M, we will basically we will find the average likelihood value for the parameter values that the parameters can take given model M. So what model M does is it restricts the values that some of the parameters can take. Now, given that restriction, what is the average value of the likelihood function? So that gives that is the marginal likelihood. And to estimate this, we have various types of estimators. What I have used is something called harmonic mean estimator. So what it does is that we find the parameter values from the posterior distribution, and whatever likelihood function values that the parameters from the posterior distribution give, we find the harmonic mean of that. So in this paper, they say that this harmonic mean will estimate the marginal likelihood as the number of sample tends to infinity.
Sujit, you have
five more minutes.
Yeah, okay, because you don't have much more time.
Yes, yes. I think it will be done in less than 5 minutes. Yeah, thank you. So we have used the harmonic mean estimator to estimate the marginal likelihood. And now we come to Bayes factor. So basically, we want to check how much better the marginal likelihood for model M1, how much better is it from model M2. So how much better is model M1 in generating the stochastic model M1 in generating the observed data D compared to model M2. So that is what this ratio is going to tell us. And there are some guidelines on when we can say that model M1 is better. So this Bayes factor, if it is, obviously if it is more than 1, that would mean that model M1 is slightly better than model M2. The marginal likelihood is higher for model M1. So if the value is between 1 and 3, so the model marginal likelihood is 3 times better. We don't usually mention that. I mean, we consider that to be a weak evidence. And if it is between 3 and 10, then we say that it is substantial evidence. And if it is somewhere between 10 and 30, then we say it is a strong evidence. If it is between 30 and 100, then we say it is a very strong evidence. And if it is greater than 100, then we say the evidence is decisive in favor of model M1. So decisively, I mean, the model M1 is better compared to model M2. Now let us look at what Bayes factor we got for the two models that we saw in the previous slide. So we found the base factor for model M1 and M2, and the base factor comes out to be greater than 100. So this is decisive evidence in favor of model 1, which said that a partially diagnostic dimension will be used only when the accuracy is high. So now how do we interpret this? So one interpretation is the observed data was much more likely to have been generated by model 1 compared to model 2. So this is one level of interpretation. Another level of interpretation will be in terms of the theories. So now that we have the base factor and results, we can say that theoretical position 1, which was our alternative hypothesis, provides a better explanation to the observed data compared to theoretical position 2, which was our null hypothesis. So I will just skip the next slide. So one more thing I have wanted to discuss, but I will just skip that. This is not very important. You can see my paper if you are interested. So now the question is, how is this different from Bayesian modeling in machine learning? So the first thing that you might have observed is that prior distribution, we are choosing to represent some theoretical positions. So in our Bayesian normal Bayesian modeling, we choose the prior probabilities so that simpler models will be preferred. We use prior probabilities to avoid overfitting, but here we are using prior probabilities to represent some theoretical position. And the other thing is that we are trying to compare how well different models can explain the data. We are not particularly interested in predicting the target variable. So what are the limitations of this method? So the limitation comes from the fact that we are sampling from the posterior distribution. So MCMC Gibbs sampling won't converge if we have a large number of parameters. So mostly for the theories that we are discussing in cognitive science, this is not a problem because the parameters that we have corresponds to the independent variables that are present in the theories that are being discussed, and any given paper discusses the relationship between just a few independent of few variables. It is never the case that I mean they are trying to find a relationship between too many variables. So very often the number of variables that we are dealing with is small. So so this approach is I mean this limitation is not a problem for this particular domain. And possibly for other domains where we want to check how well some explanation fits data when the number of variables are small. So I will stop here. If you have any questions, you may please ask. Yes, Indrajit, yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, Sujit. First of all, thanks for a nice talk. I just wanted to check. So the form of the posterior,
yes,
right? So it has to be a form that you can sample from, right? And the choice of the prior influences the form of the posterior also, right? So I was just wondering how the choice of the prior was, constrained by the fact that your posterior also has to be a form that is amenable to sampling.
Okay, so let me see. So I understand the point that you're trying to make. So this is what we do in our normal Bayesian modeling, where we want to associate a higher prior to the parameter values that will not overfit. So, but here what we are doing is we are using uniform priors. So basically, we are saying that all parameter values are equally likely. Now, any difference that we will see in the posterior distribution will be solely dependent on how well those parameter values can explain the data. It will be solely dependent on the likelihood, because the priors are going to be the same for all parameter values. So what is going to affect the posterior is simply the likelihood. So the fact that the posterior is mostly concentrated at 1 shows that that is the parameter value for which the for that parameter value, the likelihood is pretty large actually.
Sure, Sujit. So let me think more about it. Thanks.
No, hang on. Can you explain that again, Sujit? What is it that you said that? I mean, it seemed to suggest that the prior didn't matter at all. Is that what you were saying?
So when I am when the priors are when we are using uniform priors, then
it's basically like maximum likelihood. That I agree, but is that what you're saying? That basically because you're using uniform priors, then it's maximum likelihood? I mean, or it's likelihood only that matters?
What I'm saying is the likelihood, the value of the likelihood function is going to only the value of the likelihood function is going to affect the shape of the posterior distribution, because the question was about the shape of the posterior distribution. So what I was trying to point out was that the shape is going to depend only on the likelihood function value and not the prior, because I think the question was about the relationship between prior and the posterior. So that is why I said that.
No, I think Indrajit's point was that there are various choices that you have made, which will sort of, in the sense that, I mean, I'm just double guessing what I think he said, which is that, or at least this is one of the issues that I have anyway, is that if you had picked a different prior, then you could have very likely come to a different conclusion to what you did. So why should this be sort of believable? Because the choice of the prior anyway is in your hands, and you picked the prior, and then you got an answer. So, I mean, I agree that with the uniform prior, the likelihood shapes the posterior, but that sort of, for me, is sort of the least interesting part of a Bayesian model, is when you pick a uniform prior.
Can I quickly comment?
Yeah.
So Sujit, maybe I thought, there are two parts here. One is the form of the prior, which is always uniform for you, right? But there's a different part to the prior, which is uniform over what, right? And there the support set or the range probably plays a role, right? So even though it's a uniform, right, the support set or the range sort of incorporates a bias, right? But because it's uniform, right, the shape is always determined by the likelihood. Is that what you said? Because
yes.
I thought the place where you are incorporating the knowledge of the theory is in how you construct the range of the prior and the support set for it.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. So,
is there any reason to choose uniform prior, uniform distribution as a prior? It's quite a non-informative prior, isn't it?
yes. So usually the prior that is picked is non-informative. So we are not assuming anything about the threshold values. So basically here the parameters correspond to some variables that we are trying to investigate, and we are assuming, so a priori we are not making any assumptions, and we are restricting the values in such a way that it will correspond to something that we are trying to test. So I mean, I'm not sure if I'm repeating myself, but all I'm saying is that the choice of, okay, now I understand what you're, I mean, yeah. But usually so the question, let me just repeat what has been asked. So basically, if instead of uniform, if I had given a higher probability for 1 here, because and then the base factor might be different. So that I agree.
So that is one part of it, I think. The other part, I think, what Indrajit is saying is that, okay, so these endpoints that you have, that's, I mean, those you arrived at in some way. Now, although you say that you're agnostic about the values between those endpoints, but you're not agnostic about the endpoints. So I don't think you're actually considering a further prior on those endpoints, but you could have if you but it looks like these endpoints are the means of some higher prior. Is it a prior distribution, or what is it? I mean, how did you get these endpoints?
Okay, so so basically each dimension is tested 4 times, and the accuracies are going to be 0/4, 1/4, and so on. So these are the values that the accuracies can take actually in the way I have designed my experiment. In a subsequent experiment, I have tested it 6 times, and in those cases, I have more points. But to answer your question, I have also tried using a uniform distribution here. So uniform 0, 1. So now I am not choosing endpoints between 0 and 1. I have also tried that, and the result, how it changes is that instead of the posterior being concentrated at one point, I get a cloud. So I will just show that. So instead of this, what I will end up getting, the posterior distribution will look something like this. So between 0.75 and 1, I will have a sample, the marginal posterior distribution will look something like this. So basically, for the next example, actually not for this next example, the posterior distribution will look something like this. So all values between 0.75 and 1, because if the parameter s that we saw earlier, the step function, the accuracy t was our accuracy, and we were doing step t minus theta. So if and the values that the accuracy that people can have is either 1, and after that it is 0.75. So the value of theta does not matter. It can be anything between 0.75 and 1. So in that case, what I find is that there is all possible values in between 0.75 and 1. So that is how the posterior looks. The reason I have used discrete values here is because I am interested in the lower bound, the minimum accuracy with which a dimension must be learned. So that is what is getting reflected here. So that is why I've used discrete values, but I can use uniform distribution as well. That so maybe I should do that, but usually, okay.
Well, maybe there's a different way to answer this question, which is that for your null hypothesis to be true, what sort of priors or likelihood functions would be needed with the data that you had to kind of, I don't know whether these sort of counterfactual type questions, I mean, there must be a way to pose these correctly within the probabilistic reasoning world, which is what sort of prior distribution is needed so that the null hypothesis would be true. And that might be so skewed or something like that, so that because you got some factor of 100 or something, so it might be very skewed and you can say that, look, this is clearly, so you don't have to say anything. You just say that unless the priors are like this, the null hypothesis it doesn't hold. I mean, do you see what I'm saying? Or?
Yeah, I can understand what you're saying. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's not your job to sort of decide on. So one of the sort of slight perils of all of this kind of stuff is that either the prior plays too big a role or it plays no kind of role. And somewhere you have to sort of tread that line unless you have some very good reason to say that this is the prior. So, Indrajit, am I making any sense here, or is this?
No, I think that made perfect sense, Ashwin. But except that the earlier point that you made, I mean, it sounds reasonable. It's just that I don't know at this point how to do it, but it's a reasonable question to ask.
Yeah, so I wonder what the probabilistic counterpart of counterfactuals
Right.
are. That what should had the prior been this, what would have been? I mean, that must be that is a counterfactual type reasoning.
Right. So it's just that counterfactual reasoning at this point is defined in terms of values of variables, random variables, rather than forms of parameters.
Yeah,
of distribution.
exactly. But then, but then it could be the value of a higher prior.
So which is also a random variable in some sense, right?
Yeah.
So it's not the random variable is not a draw from a distribution, but it's a parameter to a distribution.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it's a random variable nonetheless. Yeah.
Sujit, I'd asked Indrajit along because as far as I'm concerned, he's the best probabilistic modeling guy in the country, and you would probably find it very much worth your while to discuss your ideas with him.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm sure he'd be happy to help out as well. He's part of AppCare in a sort of adjunct type role. So it would be sort of very helpful for your work, I think, if you could somehow.
Yes, I will get in touch with Professor Indrajit.
Yeah, especially all this Bayesian stuff and all that. I mean, it's all sort of stuff that he knows inside out. So, and there may be much better ways in which you could think about this or present it or whatever.
Okay.
So I'm not sure about the introduction that Ashwin gave, but Sujit, I'll be happy to talk to you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. So great. Thank you, Sujit. Any other questions, or if anybody else has any other questions, and otherwise we can call it a day. I'm sort of shuttling between a conference and here, so I'm sort of have to rush back, I think. So, okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.